Tony DeWitt here, Missouri appellate attorney, retired. None of what follows is legal advice. I'm here to do some video for you today to talk about an interesting subject on the law, and here it is. So today is day 3 of the cruise, and it's the first port day. We're going to be stopping in Cozumel, and we're going to have a cooking class with one of their local chefs. So I'm really looking forward to that because I love to cook different kinds of foods. So today, riffing on what I did yesterday on critical thinking, we're going to talk about applying critical thinking in the real world. Specifically, we're going to look at trial issues, hoax issues, and media bias issues. Now, I don't mean for this to be political, so I've chosen examples from both sides of the political spectrum, and I don't want anybody to take away any suggestion that I'm biased one way or the other, because I have tried to be as balanced as I possibly can be in doing this. That's part of what critical thinking is. So at trial, each side has a narrative. If you looked at Charlie Adelson's trial, for example, and you looked at the narrative from the defense side, he's just a lovable filler of cavities with an interesting girlfriend who just happened to have a couple of hoodlums for chums. And the girlfriend's hoodlum chums blackmailed him, telling him if they didn't get paid, they'd whack his brother-in-law and blame him. And Charlie didn't pay, and in order to sell this narrative and get past the direct testimony of Katie, Charlie had to testify and tell his story. And of course, Charlie's testimony on direct did him no favors. The prosecution, of course, had a different theory. Big Mama wanted Dan Markel out of the way, so she got Charlie to pay Katie to pay the hoodlums to whack Dan Markel. They had the testimony of the other 3 participants in the conspiracy. They had the bump. They had the phone calls. And they presented all of that to the jury. Now, a jury critically thinking about all of this would have had to, 1, disregard the direct evidence of involvement in the phone calls, 2, ignore the testimony of the other conspirators, and 3, evaluate Charlie as the second coming of St. Jerome and believe he was pure as the driven snow. Yeah, that didn't happen. Usually, the most logical story wins out with a jury, but not always. The prosecution put on a very good circumstantial case against Casey Anthony. They said she's a liar, and they went through all the different things that she lied about, things like her employment, all the different tales that she'd told. And they said, if she lied about that, well, then surely she's lying about her daughter's untimely demise or being missing. And I thought that was a pretty decent narrative for a prosecution. They went into the case without a body. They came out with one. The problem for the prosecution was that they went up against a very, very good defense attorney. And the defense did the absolute right thing from the beginning. They said, yeah, she's a liar, but she's not a murderer. As a result, Casey Anthony was acquitted on the most serious charges, but she was convicted for lying. It was an excellent piece of lawyering, but it was a very poor result for the state. In the trial in a civil case, both sides have narratives. The plaintiff says the light for him was green. The defendant says the light for her was green. Both things cannot be true. So the jury has to think critically about the evidence in the case. Did the plaintiff have a drinking problem? Was the defendant charged by the police with the accident? Did the plaintiff use a chiropractor maybe to bump up the damages? All of these things work their way into the decision by the jury. And if they do it right, they wait till all the evidence has come in and they evaluate it using the skills that we talked about yesterday: reflective thinking, analytical thinking, and open-mindedness. Now, I want to move on next to hoaxes. Many times, hoaxes are designed, essentially propaganda operations that are shaped to determine a particularly bad political narrative for the guy who is the subject of the hoax. For example, during the early days of the Trump administration, the assertion was that Mr. Trump was a Russian asset. There was this dossier that was purported to show that he was in bed with the Russians. And in fact, that dossier was paid for by the opposing political party. There was never any real substance to it, but the narrative that was born out of it certainly made it seem that there was a problem. Everybody remembers that Mr. Trump was supposedly a Russian asset because that was the story that got told first. Few people remember that he was cleared by the Mueller report. And as a result of that, that hoax continues to have a great deal of power with people who don't like Mr. Trump. Sometimes, however, the hoax is a product of the manipulation of a person's words or video. For example, recently there was a videotape released on X by Elon Musk that purported to show Kamala Harris saying bad things about Biden and bad things about herself. It was pretty obvious parody.
Kamala Harris and your Democrat candidate for president because Joe Biden finally exposed his senility at the debate. Thanks, Joe. I was selected because I am the ultimate diversity hire. I'm both a woman and a person of color.
But if it had not been, if it had been reported as the truth, how would you have told? Of course, one way would be to look at the video. Was Ms. Harris shown front on saying these words? No. In fact, Ms. Harris was never shown speaking those words because she didn't speak them. It was an AI-generated voice. And it was all kinds of film of Kamala Harris and all kinds of film about the various issues surrounding the country. But it wasn't her. And when people do things like this, they count on others not being curious and not being willing to go beyond the narrative that's been provided. That's how hoaxes have power. They have power because people don't think critically and they don't apply logic to the situation. Now, another hoax that was the product of imprecision in wording and was in fact a self-administered wound. I often wondered if Mr. Trump had to go get his feet taken care of because he shot himself in the foot so often when he was president. The very fine people hoax arose out of comments that Donald Trump made after the Charlottesville incident, where a young woman was killed by a group of neo-Nazis. Like all protests do, this protest, which was about the destruction of Civil War area statues, had people on both sides of the issue. So when Mr. Trump was speaking about the people protesting about the statues, he said that there were very fine people on both sides, meaning very fine people who wanted the Civil War statues gone and very fine people who wanted the Civil War statues to remain. He did say the words, very fine people, but he didn't say the words in the context that the media portrayed. The media suggested that he said those words to describe the neo-Nazis as very fine people. But if we look at the transcript, we see that that is not the case. And here's what Trump said. I think there's blame on both sides. If you reported it accurately, you would say that the neo-Nazis started this thing. So up front, he's saying they're to blame. They didn't put themselves down as neo-Nazis. You had some very bad people in that group. So first words out of his mouth, very bad people in the group of neo-Nazis. You also had some very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. And then he goes on to talk a little bit about George Washington and says, you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, they should be condemned totally. So again, President Trump had actually been fairly clear that he wasn't giving them any kudos. He was instead actually critiquing them and saying that they should not have done what they did. And we also see that he later suggested that he denounced the neo-Nazis and said they should be condemned completely. If anyone was fooled by this hoax, it was their own fault. The transcript of the president's words was available almost immediately after that incident. Conservative media and social media posted this information and made the case that this was a hoax. The corporate media, however, did not. And to this day, Mr. Biden continues to suggest that this is why he ran for the presidency. He knows better. Mrs. Harris knows better. But it was such a convenient way to demonize a political opponent, and there are so many people who do not think critically that they continue to repeat it. Critically thinking persons who heard this and thought it was over the top, as I did when I first heard it, might well have thought, well, the media wouldn't report it if it wasn't true. But we know that the media frequently reports things that are not true. I've had cases where the facts presented in court and the media portrayal of those facts in the newspaper did not match up. It was like a game of telephone. There's a brown and white cow on the starting end, and by the time you get to the end, it's a giraffe that's pink and purple. And that's pretty much what happens sometimes with people who sit in court, don't understand the process, and they wind up having to write about it when they know nothing. Media get things wrong. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It means they have a job to do, and sometimes that job is pleasing their bosses. And sometimes those bosses have, predispositions to favor one side or the other. So what I did when I heard this is I went and pulled the transcript. When a president is in office, every word he speaks in public is transcribed and retained for later. It goes into the presidential archives. I looked at the transcript and saw that it did not say what the media said that it did. That is what's called critical thinking. You judge the content of the speech by the actual content of the speech, not what is reported in the newspaper. Because when the newspapers and media showed this, they showed Trump saying the thing about very fine people. They never said that he was discussing the neo-Nazis. They just allowed you to assume that because of the underlying incident. So it wasn't direct disinformation, it was just a subtle attempt to shape the political narrative. Media bias is all around us. Conservatives believe that the corporate media outlets like CBS, NBC, ABC, NPR, MSNBC, and CNN are all in the bag for the Democrats. The belief is that anything reported by those outlets should be carefully fact-checked. Conservatives do this without a hint of irony and without accounting for how Fox News frequently frames things in a manner that would be antagonistic to the other political party. If you watch Fox News, for example, you know that everything that Kamala Harris says is a word salad. Now, word salad is an interesting term. It connotes somebody throwing a bunch of stuff together and calling it good. And while I would agree that sometimes if you look at the transcript of what Kamala Harris says, it seems to be something of a stream of consciousness dictation. If you read it and analyze it carefully, you can easily discern the meaning, and in most cases, it's not hard. Just because someone doesn't speak the way you do doesn't mean that they are a bad person, and it doesn't mean that they're lying. So when you hear the term word salad, what you should do is you should go look at the transcript of those remarks, read the transcript, and determine what it is she's really saying. Because if you have decent reading skills, you'll be able to figure it out. Many times people who are nervous about speaking in public, and if I was running for president, I'd probably be mortified that I'd say something stupid. And knowing me, I'm sure I would say something stupid. But all the words are written down, And smart people go and look at what she said. There's an interesting story about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Franklin Roosevelt used to have fireside chats. He was a very persuasive speaker. And one of the people on the opposing party said that they never listened to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's speech live. They never listened to it on the radio. They read it afterwards, because when they read it, they were not moved the way they were when they heard it, because he was such a powerful speaker. That's what you have to be wary of. There are always attempts to manipulate you using speech, using data, using information, even using video. As you know, I'm a free speech absolutist. I believe that the remedy for bad speech is more speech and not less speech. Governor Newsom, in response to that rather ridiculous thing that Elon Musk posted, came out with a new statute that forbids the use of deepfakes in political commercials. While the United States Supreme Court differentiates between commercial speech and political speech, with the former being more highly regulated than the latter, the fact is the First Amendment would probably allow a person to use parody or other means to attack their opponents. Free speech is often ugly speech. If you have any doubts, go look at what Westboro Baptist Church did. Free speech is often disinformation. But here's the thing. During World War II, Winston Churchill said that the truth is so important that sometimes it must be surrounded by a bodyguard of lies. And unfortunately, free speech, in order for it to remain free for all of us, has to allow, to a certain extent, that some misinformation, some disinformation is going to be circulated. And you have to remember that speech that is described as disinformation is often described solely to suppress the underlying message. And it's necessary to have certain guardrails, but the statute that Governor Newsom signed, I don't believe will be held up in court. We'll have to wait and see how that shakes out. All of this to say that we owe to each other a duty to be careful about the information that we receive and how we respond to it. We need to think critically. We need to evaluate bias. We need to evaluate content. We need to go to original sources. We need to evaluate those sources. We need to do all of these things in order to reach a clear understanding of the information presented. When he met with President Gorbachev of Russia in Iceland, and they were talking about, I believe, one of the START treaties, President Reagan pulled a line from the Russian proverbs. And he said that we should trust but verify. And that's not actually a bad approach to information that you evaluate. You can trust some parts of it, but you always have to verify the authenticity, the source, and the truthfulness of that material. There is no unbiased reporting source. Everybody who writes news, everybody who does a YouTube video, anybody who recites the news on television, they all have a bias. They may make their bias known openly or through their reporting, but they have a bias. It irritates me when people claim that MSNBC is biased, but don't see any bias in Fox News. When lawyers pick a jury, they probe for bias. They probe for bias both generally and then as it applies to the subject at issue. How many of you here believe that damages in a lawsuit are too big? That's a general probe. How many of you believe, for example, in a car accident that involves slick roads and bald tires, one of the questions might very well be that during the voir dire you hear, how many of you have had to replace your tires because you were afraid of skidding into another car on a wet road? Lawyers evaluate based on that question whether or not whether or not to put people on the jury, whether or not they have a bias, and also, of course, to preface a little bit and preview a little bit some of the evidence that's going to be presented. The news you see should be about the truth, but it isn't. And I think we all know that it isn't. In the movie The Princess Bride, young Wesley tells Princess that life is pain, and that anyone who tells you otherwise is trying to sell you something. The same thing might very well be said about the news. Any news outlet that tells you it's unbiased is definitely trying to sell you something. But it's up to you to detect that bias, evaluate that bias, and correct for it in how you process the information they present. One of my friends in the military was a military intelligence specialist in Vietnam. And his job was to go out into the village and recruit sources and obtain information about the communist insurgency there. The military had a way of grading those sources. An A1 source was someone whose information you could take to the bank. They were routinely and regularly right about everything. And an F6 source was someone who lied repeatedly and tried to sell you something that would perhaps get you harmed. When he told people this information, they repeatedly asked him, well, I guess you only talk to the A1 sources, right? And he said, no, that's not what they did. An A1 source and an F6 source can both be very valuable. If an A1 source says that something is definitely not going to happen, an F6 source says that something is definitely going to happen, those two sources corroborate each other and the event is definitely not going to happen. To a certain extent, a critical thinker evaluating news, information, and media might very well apply the same set of tools to the information they receive in the political sphere. Critical thinking is exceptionally important, particularly in the context of politics, because the first casualty of any election season is the truth. That's what I have for you today. Thank you so much for watching. If you have the opportunity, do something kind for someone today. And then, when you're done, come on back down here, join me at the beach. We'll talk about something else fun.
Hey, as I said at the beginning, none of what I said is legal advice. But let me tell you what, the stuff that's going to be right up here, these are the things that YouTube thinks you might be interested in going forward. Have a terrific day.